The last thing you want to associate with Disney and villains is the word boring. That you just can't find yourself picturing that existing because villains have a certain spice to them, being the most memorable parts of their films. I mean, sure, you might say this one I'm mentioning is somewhat memorable compared to others since it was part of the Renaissance era, but still how it wasn't really the strongest at all. Where it obviously has to come from the film Pocahontas being that weak spot during the Renaissance. Not being the best, but still also not being the worst thing they did. Where unfortunately, Governor Ratcliffe is also painfully a boring element of that film itself. A villain with mediocre motivations and an uninteresting character development that drag any action of the story since the main hero doesn't even interact with him at all. Of course, some might disagree with me, and that's fine, everything has their own particular taste, but in this case, I just can't find it to be very compelling when the go is to go against any action that the hero has. You know, you think about other villains during the release during this time in Disney, and you see something that directly impacts their characters and the journey. Thinking about Jafar using the street rat Aladdin, Ursula using Ariel's voice, Frollo raising Quasimodo, Hades trying to stop Hercules from ruining his fate, Gaston trying to have Belle, and so on and so on. The basic point of what you have been seeing in these examples I'm highlighting is a direct contact of ideas that straightens the story overall to what we know, to encourage the hero to be better or put them down in a certain point of the film. But how instead, with what you're going to get with the piss poor example of villainous Ratcliffe, is how that idea doesn't really exist at all. I mean, sure, it's still easy to argue that he has good qualities of a normal villain, which by good I mean really bad, being extremely hateful of a race or looking down upon others as inferior, but just not enough to satisfy anything that would have made Pocahontas a better story. He's just particularly stupid if I do say so myself, for he believes he's a good man in some way if you can believe that yourself, indulgent in things in the name of the crown in the search for nothing but gold. With gold of course being his one and only huge motivation and driving force during the entire course of the film without interacting with Pocahontas at all and barely having any relationship to John Smith, who is also particularly boring himself. I also realize that I am mostly monotone myself, and I am boring also, so this video suits me just fine because I'm just that type of person, and a bored person making something as meaningless as this, so why not indulge in that very fashion? So when you go back to the very beginning, he leads this crew on a journey with John Smith for adventure and freedom as the script is supposed to go, the statements that were made to get them on the journey to the new world, a journey for the glory of King James and, more importantly, gold again to mention. The typical image where you kind of already get the picture of who is the villain by his posture and design, but not doing anything quite drastic than what he says. Not really a villain and just more of an uninteresting dude who likes gold. But of course, he then reveals later that he doesn't care about the other men, saying that they're peasants because he's just there for the damn gold, and John Smith removing savages from harming them at all, so he can comfortably relax and climb this social ladder back home. His entire journey is just him being a vain, jealous, selfish brat who got bitter people mocked him for not being rich enough, at least in our minds. Like, that's it. The entire go, even after they meet Pocahontas and the other Native Americans, is just gold, gold, and gold. I know I've already mentioned this part of the character millions of times, but that's really it. He doesn't really have anything else to go off of that, and doesn't really have a high opinion about himself because he lacks what others have above that. Even the king, hence why he dreamed of being lorded by the king himself, or maybe interpreting himself being higher than the king himself in this screwed up opinion. I mean, I will give him credit for being one of those Disney villains that have such low self-esteem who wants to climb a social ladder, thinking down about himself, but that's the only real interesting thing I could really say. Putting him down with go, just helping him out, and not doing much as we said earlier with the others in comparison. I guess we can also mention his commanding presence over the other men, working hard to dig, and diggity dig to find nothing but dirt, but for the promise of mine, as that song to solidify his motivations until the climax comes in to demonstrate those other racist traits he has, but that's truly about it. The troops are just his tools and nothing more than that, not caring about the well-being, putting some of them down to his level as he is just bitter about his life. Because just when you look at him, you notice that half the scenes are just about how lazy this guy really is, eating food, coming up with the most stupidest of conclusions about people at all. Sure, the natives attack them as invaders and enemies, but he just comes out with this dumb idea again revolving around gold, that everything and any action that goes against him is that they're hiding the fact that there's gold in these hills, digging so hard just yet to find nothing, but knowing that there are other people living out here, so that they probably hid it from them. They don't want to share, so instead of listening to the logical Wiggins by his side say that that they themselves invaded their land and stole their resources, trashing the environment, he thinks it's all about gold. Where to be fair for Wiggins, he is a more interesting character to focus on rather than Ratcliffe, since they're voiced by the same person and is a much more smarter character and has more personality regardless, instead of a big old dum-dum here demanding people do his dirty work or hang any traitors who suggest otherwise, one that is just truly part for his own selfish plans that make sense for the directors to make. You see, the greater problem with all of this, even though having such ignorance is great for a villain in terms of the story about trying to see the colors of the wind and the broader picture of life, is the fact that he never meets Pocahontas at all in the film, as we've said many times before. Not until the direct-to-DVD sequel for that matter, where he actually is a threat. There's just no information to make him a really impactful villain to prove he is what he say he is, because he's not attempting to challenge his or her perspective like the secret journey she had with John Smith, how she went with him to change his opinion about savages and nature and what we do living with the land. Everything they deal with in this regards to each other is only dealt with at a distance and only seen by one side, with Pocahontas' family thinking John was responsible for Kocoum's death or whatever since they were closer in view, rather than a far-off lackadaisical attitude that Ratcliffe had displayed this entire time. It doesn't help that none of these attitudes of the troops even make sense with the entire freaking historical context of a non-existent relationship where you gotta make up useless shit that leads him to the most dumbest conclusions possible.
The gold is as good as mine.
Like, yeah, you see him pathetically hide behind a tent claiming that the gold is mine, but it's done without any substantial proof yet again since John was captured. The others just caring about his well-being, where he'd be executed for sure, but how he's just giddy for the fact that he could have gold because they captured him. The song Savages might express how he feels a bit, but you're still reminded that that is in the back of his mind, where his attention is only focused on this idea of resources that don't even exist in Virginia. A villain has to have something worth mentioning in their backstory that shapes them to think about the world in a certain way, to get ahead in life using anyone as a means to an end. That they are developed in a way that makes the story move forward rather than being sidelined as it was for the most part of the film. It doesn't feel like he's the main focus because that's not the point. Sure, he's the big bad of what they actually interpret when it comes to the Powhatans, but that's not what you actually get when you see Pocahontas and John Smith interact and going back and forth. There just isn't anything to challenge him or Pocahontas in their perspectives that they both provide, since they hardly want that to happen in their boring love story. You have songs like Colors of the Wind and Just Around the Riverbend to make you realize the stupidity of the perspectives like Mine, but then again you have nothing to interact with them in any way. Couldn't have her enter the camp because probably she'd be killed off like John Smith if that's what they were thinking, or just in any other normal interaction that could have set a much more logical threat. Like he could have actually manipulated situations and said things about her opinions, but that's not how it works, because John and the Indians communicate through these magical tree. Just nothing makes sense about this film, I'm sorry. Where you do have to say that this villain had nothing to offer when the sequel even contradicts some of his own poorly fleshed out self with the self-doubting motivations we saw in the first, saying he was never popular, where he actually turns out to be in this film a highly respected figure in the British court, even manipulating the king himself as a close advisor. Like, he was never punished for his actions at the end when they gagged him and sent him back to England on the ship for trying to attempt to kill John Smith even though he stepped in the way, where instead of his punishment he's just that close to the king himself, if that makes any sense. That all just oozes laziness on their part and is absolutely boring, where they had no choice but to revisit this dumb idea that made no sense at all. You could have instead made a new villain that was a snobby rich man who had no personality, and you would have lost nothing, and made something 10 times more interesting with someone who actually could give Pocahontas a new perspective rather than rave about how freaking dirt had gold for some awfully idiotic reason. Or of course you could have actually fleshed out saying he was a criminal and trying to manipulate events in that way, but nothing again in these films just never made any sense. The only explanation that could be offered for this is that since he is a darker representation of John Smith after something in adventure for his part, that he could probably have been changed by Pocahontas' experience if he interacted with her, so he really couldn't be there to solidify himself in his own opinion. But I think that would have still been overall beneficial to have him darken his heart and not listen at all, where what he came for was just all for nothing. Still after the treasure, still actually fleshed out to develop since he was a nobody, where he could have said that what they had was intangible and realistic to her interactions with nature. The expectations that say, I come here for resources, but that nothing lasts forever. Focusing again on the material and spiritual realms of how these stories work. And if they have gone that route, he could have been a much better villain. Not saying he would have been good in my eyes, but just enough to the point that I wouldn't be bored with his existence and the ghosts that are so tame and lame. It's just so interesting that all of this was based upon the twisted irony of real life, where he wasn't as bad as this boring as fictional counterpart that tried to negotiate deals with Chief Powhatan, but how they all managed to kill them all anyway. Just too messy where they came up with something random for the sake of this romantical story that just never made sense. So when you look back upon a character like Ratcliffe, you see a husk, an incomplete shell of an idea that never really worked other than his meaningless quest for gold as that only motivation. That despite all the bad that they put in him with his xenophobic, greedy racism, it never felt complete as a normal Disney villain should. No time to feel really a part of the story of Pocahontas except when they were apart from each other in that sense. That no matter how emotional a story could be about a group of people with a real world history, the execution is the thing that remains to be the most important, and they failed badly with a story and a character like this. I wish I could say more about him, but because of the title and me actually being bored with his character, there unfortunately isn't much to say about the rest. Of course, everything is open to opinion, and if you think he's a good fit and Pocahontas was a good movie with a good message, then I fully accept them what you believe. But for me, this is just nothing but a big great dud, and hopefully we could have moved on from this phase. So I'm all done. Goodbye.